that morning I was driving to Long Island to try out for the FDNY hockey team. I had finished up the academy the day before. We weren't scheduled to report to our firehouses until the 13th, I believe, because ironically, my whole class was scheduled to go to the Trade Center on September 12th to be the victims for an FBI terrorism drill, which somehow gets lost in this whole story, which I find very ironic. That I don't know if we're lucky that it was a day later, or I don't know what that means, but yeah. So my whole class, we got out on the 10th. I was scheduled to go to the firehouse on the 13th, but on the 11th, I was driving to Freeport, and when I got to the Verrazano Bridge, I could see one of the towers on fire. So I turned on the radio to find out what was going on. I immediately called my brother Andy, who he's a captain in the fire department now. He was a firefighter at the time, and he told me to go home and get my gear. So I immediately turned around, drove back home, swapped out my hockey bag for my gear bag, and reported to the nearest firehouse with a couple of the guys that were in my carpool. We got to the firehouse. They ended up shipping us to another firehouse, Rescue 5, on Clove Road here in Staten Island. From there, they took us to the ferry terminal. And while we were mustered up at the ferry terminal, a chief came around looking for people with O negative blood. So me and the lieutenant next to me, I couldn't even tell you his name at this point, were the only two to raise our hands. So we felt compelled to go give a pint of blood, because they were expecting, a lot of casualties. So we went to, I believe it was St. Vincent's Hospital at the time, and gave a pint of blood. Then I ended up at another firehouse. After that, I don't even know how they got me to another firehouse. And then I got on a bus and finally headed to Ground Zero, which at the time seemed like it was days before I got there. In the interim, I had a little contact with my family. I was able to get my brother Andy on the phone one more time. He was actually there, and he was trying to describe to me what was going on, but cell phones weren't really working great. He was cutting in and out, so, we kind of lost touch. I had another brother, Joe, who was working for Goldman Sachs at the time, and I had no contact with him. His office was on Water Street. So, I had two brothers that were down there. I lost contact with them. As I said, eventually I got down there probably, I want to say, late afternoon, early evening. And by the time I got there, you could barely see what was going on. I came in from the south, I guess through the Battery Park underpass. But once I got out of the tunnel, I really had no idea where I was. It was I now know I was on West Street, but it was impossible to tell where you were. I remember pretty distinctly all the buildings on the right side, which I guess were, south of the Trade Center, were engulfed in flames. Fire out pretty much every window. There were hose lines going in and out of a lot of hose lines going into the building, people scrambling around to stretch them out. And I really didn't know what I was doing. I hadn't been to a fire yet. Never, stretched a hose line in anger, as they say. So I just went up to the first chief I could find and asked him what to do. And he had me help flake out the hose, chase the kinks, all that kind of stuff. Then after that, I started not feeling too great. I had given a pint of blood. I'm pretty sure I hadn't eaten anything at that point. And I recall sitting on the wall that divides West Street, which is a nice planter now, but whatever it was a concrete wall then. And I remember looking up, and there was a McDonald's worker standing there with a tray with orange juice and hamburgers. And the last thing I wanted to do was eat food, so I just took a carton of orange juice and downed it. Felt a little better, and I got up and found another chief, and he had me walking around with parking cones I don't even know where the parking codes came from at this point, but he had me walking around and marking any body parts that I could find, which unfortunately weren't many. But you know, whatever I could find, I put a cone there. And eventually, I found myself, I guess, at the end of the line of a bucket brigade. You know, these memories go in and out, but I remember, you know, seeing people looking down in voids and just seeing people stationed all the way along the way and handing buckets back, or whatever debris. I don't even know if they had buckets at that point. But then I started, I wouldn't say blacking out, but my nose started bleeding. I got a pretty bad bloody nose. I had one of those N95 face masks on for a little bit, but the outside of it was so caked in dust that I couldn't get air through it. You know, the dust was so thick that, you know, as you would sweat, it would start to stick to your face, you know, and it ended up like cake batter, you know, all over your face, and the mask would ended up like caked on. So I had to take it off because my nose started bleeding, and it wouldn't stop. It bled probably for like 2 or 3 hours. So I remember laying down on the wheel of a giant bulldozer, and I must have blacked out. And I woke up to all the sounds of, you know, the machinery, and oddly enough, what woke me up was somebody was yelling my friend's name. One of the guys I had gone down there with. His father was a captain on the fire department. He was looking for him because he hadn't heard from him. So somebody was walking around screaming his name, and that's what woke me up. And then the rest of the time, I just kind of, you know, I mean, now I know I was in shock. I was just kind of looking around, hoping to find my brother, just asking anybody, you know, what I can do to help, or, you know, looking for spots where I could fill in. But like I said, I really didn't know what I was doing. So I was just kind of hoping for, you know, somebody to tell me what to do, really. At one point, I remember I did run into the company that I was scheduled to go work at. At that time, the fire department was doing this pilot program where you would go to the academy for 2 months, and then you would go into the field for what they called field training for 14 weeks, which you would just, you know, rotated into the firehouse and you were part of the company, but technically you hadn't graduated the academy yet. So I hadn't met any of these guys yet. It was ladder 136 in Elmhurst, Queens, and I happened to bump into them there. So I remember I introduced myself, but they were all pretty much in shock too. And the last thing they wanted to do was deal with, you know, shiny proby. So yeah. So after that, you know, I'm not really sure how those next few hours went. You know, as time goes on, you know, I used to try to write this stuff down, but as time goes on, you know, these things, you know, I guess I wouldn't say they go out of my mind, but, you know, I guess self-preservation, you know, you start to not remember things. But yeah, I mean, a few distinct memories I have from that day would be just, you know, those towers were so huge and massive, and I just remember them being in that pile of rubble, and it was just concrete and steel, really, and there weren't much remnants of the contents of the building. You know, that's what really stuck out. You know, we didn't find desks, chairs, computers, phones, you know, all the things that you would find in an office, which we now know was pulverized and in the air that we were breathing. Well, if you can call it air. Yeah, I mean, some of the things that stick out to me were the density of the dust. You know, you could reach out and grab a handful of it with your hand. You know, I've always thought that I kind of knew that that it was bad. I remember when I was sitting on that wall drinking that orange juice, thinking that, you know, this could end up being what kills me, you know, because in the academy they teach you the dangers of breathing in pulverized glass, asbestos, um, you know, yeah, fuel vapors, pretty much everything that we were breathing in that day. So, you know, I remember having that distinct thought that this is not good. You know, this is probably down the line, you know. I mean, I was 21, so I wasn't really, when you're 21 years old, I don't really think you ever think anything, you know, anything bad is going to happen. You know, 20 years down the road, it's hard to imagine what's going to happen, but it was pretty clear to me then that it was pretty bad. I'm trying to think of what other memories stick out to me about that day. I mean, I never did find my brother. I never did hear from my other brother. I actually didn't hear from him for a few days. He had made his way up West Street and onto a ferry boat and got into Weehawken and then walked to Hoboken to his apartment. So a few days later, by the time I got home to a phone, at some point we spoke, but it was, and my brother Andy, I never heard from again. Well, obviously again, but I didn't hear from him the rest of that day. But a day or two later, I made my way to his firehouse just because I needed to see him or hear him, because at that point we didn't know. You know, there were reports that there were thousands of firemen missing. So we didn't know what the story was, you know. Either we heard upwards of 600-700 members dead. So for me, I just needed to see him, you know. So I remember going to his firehouse. It was the middle of the day, and they said he just came back and he's sleeping. So I just went in the bunk room and turned on the light and leaned over his bunk and saw he was breathing, and then that was good enough for me, and I left. Back to ground zero, I stayed there probably until 6 or 7 o'clock the next morning. Eventually, you know, I was very lightheaded. You know, who knows how much blood I had lost and I hadn't eaten. And I eventually made my way over to a chief. Again, couldn't tell you who it was, but he told me to leave. He said me and a couple other guys to go down to the ferry and you know, go back to Staten Island. So that's what I did. That was a pretty surreal moment. Also, I remember walking through Battery Park and it was desolate and everything was covered in white. And you know, if you remember that week, the weather was beautiful. It was, you know, you couldn't ask for better weather. It was, you know, in the 70s, you know, no humidity. So it was like a weird feeling because it kind of felt like it had just snowed, you know, and but yet the weather was perfect, but everything had this beautiful glow from all the lights shining off of this toxic dust that covered everything. I remember that. I got onto the ferry, found a bench and passed out, and that was the end of that day for me. You know, I went home and slept a couple hours and then drove out to Queens to my firehouse to see what I was supposed to do next. And they basically said, go home, go to sleep, and come back tomorrow. And that's what I did. And
you were 21. It was your first day on the job with the FDNY. And you told me that on a bus, a chaplain came on the bus, an FDNY chaplain, and gave the entire busload the last rites.
yeah, that happened when I left Rescue 5. We were on the bus heading to the ferry. And at that point, you know, I wouldn't say the mood was light by any means, but, you know, as I told you, a few of the guys were breaking my chops because my gear was brand new. You know, there were tags still on it. So I was pulling off the tags, trying to put my suspenders on, and they were all making fun of me, you know, saying things like, would you steal your father's gear? Because I was 21, but I had a shaved head and I looked like I was about 15 at that point. So they were breaking my chops, and then this priest, I didn't notice that he was on the bus, but he just stood up in the front and started talking. I remember him describing what we were going into. At that point, we didn't know what kind of attack it was. There were reports that missiles were coming. The jets started mobilizing overhead, so we didn't know what we were going into. So he read us some sort of psalm, and then he read us our last rites, and then the bus just got completely silent for the rest of the way. But yeah, surprisingly, I didn't mention earlier, but that moment always stuck out to me. It was actually the second time in my life that I had my last rites read to me, and I was only 21. Still only the second time it's been done, so we're doing good. But
First time?
First time I was a baby. I had some sort of virus, ironically, a respiratory virus. My lungs had collapsed, and I had 105 fever, and the doctors didn't know what to do, so I had a priest come in, read me my last rites. Apparently my father tried to throw the orderlies out the window, and then this amazing doctor came in, Dr. Kasandi, and he took me and he just ran me to another room and put me in a giant tub of ice, got my fever down, and eventually it broke, and I'm still here.
Tell us how this has impacted your health and thus reshaped your entire life.
It initially, like I said, it started with those bloody noses, which lasted probably, 4 years. I had surgery in 2005. But yeah, my nose bled pretty much every day. I had the surgery and the bloody noses stopped. And then in 2008, we had an accident with the rig at work, and I collided with another fire truck, responded to a run. It was pretty bad. And I ended up with a concussion, and they did a CAT scan and found that I had dozens of polyps on my sinuses and my nasal cavity, which at the time the doctor kind of just played off like, you should get this checked sort of thing. But over time, it started getting harder and harder for me to breathe. I was getting sinus infections all the time. Every little bit of smoke, everything would just swell up. I was on antibiotics a lot. So in 2010, I had surgery to have the polyps removed. And after that, I went back to work, but it was very difficult. I couldn't breathe in smoke at all. The tiniest bit of smoke, I would instantly get sick. I ended up, I think in my last 2 years, I was on antibiotics 20 times. I was in the hospital a couple times. The final straw was I went to a very small fire, and I was walking, basically just checking the hallways and breathing, like I said, a minute amount of smoke. And when I got back to the firehouse, I was pulling off my boots, and this bright yellow liquid just started pouring out of my nose. It looked like yellow Gatorade, and it was pretty scary. It just wouldn't stop. It was just pouring out. And I looked up, and my lieutenant was standing there, and he just kind of threw his hands up because he had known that I was having sinus issues and problems. He was also having similar issues. So he just looked at me and was like, it's time to do something. So I went back to my surgeon, and he ripped me a new one and basically told me that surgery wasn't so I can go back to fighting fires. It was so that I could have some sort of quality of life, and the more toxins and crap I breathed in, the worse I'm going to get. So that was the start of it. And then it's just led to a slew of other issues. I now have, I have nodules on my thyroid and my lymph nodes. I also have sleep apnea, GERD, PTSD, which is the most common one, pretty much. I have some neurological issues, which unfortunately at the moment isn't covered under the 9/11 bill. But there are thousands of people like me that the symptoms are like fibromyalgia, neuropathy, shaking, things that mimic, like Parkinson's or MS or stuff, but it's not exactly that, but basically just a bunch of, it's hard to describe. I don't know if you've had neuropathy, you might have dealt with it with, I know chemo brings that on, but it's basically just numbness, pain, all these weird sensations all day long, all night. That's why I've had to start walking with a cane, because sometimes my feet just go numb while I'm walking, and I'll just, fall down. Like, I don't use one around the house, but a few times this summer I've just fallen down on the lawn, which kind of sucks. Then there's my lungs. I remember in April of 2001, I had my pre-hiring medical, and I had a 94% lung capacity. And then in October of 2001, from when they sent us for our post 9/11 medical, I had a 79% lung capacity, which is a pretty significant drop off in 6 months, for a 21-year-old non-smoker. So far, my lungs are okay, but, I do have difficulty breathing. I'm still in that safe 75 to 79% range. So, it's hard to.
You were 21, first day on the FDNY 9/11. How old were you when you had to retire from the FDNY?
I was 33. It was December of 2012. I went on my last run. Ironically, I think it was July 14th or 15th, 2012. It's a fire at the South Seaport. Very smoky. The deck was on fire. And of course, by the time I got back to the firehouse, I had a sinus infection, and that was it. I went sick from there, and I ended up on light duty for just about 4 or 5 months, and that was it.
Any regrets joining the FDNY like your brother?
I think I don't know if regret is the right word. Other things I would do differently, perhaps, maybe, but I'm not really sure there's much I could have done differently. I try not to live with regrets, but I think you'd be kind of crazy not to have some sort of second thought about, at least, you know what? I would say the only regret I have is that I didn't listen to my doctors in 2008 to 2010. There's nothing we could have done about 9/11. I mean, we all say we would have went anyway, and I know it's cliche, but it's the truth. What else were we going to do? I had family members there, I had friends there. It never even occurred to me not to go there. But, as I said earlier, I didn't really know what I was doing. So that's the hard part to resolve with me, is I feel like I went there, I breathed in this stuff, not just that day, but, I went back later on also, and I really don't feel like I helped anyone, I mean, that's the hard part is that I went there, I breathed in all that crap, and I'm not sure I made much of a difference. Me personally, I know collectively we made a huge difference, but so the regrets for me is that I didn't listen to my doctors, because I wanted to keep being a fireman. I liked it. I loved, I know firemen say it all the time, but we really do love going to work. That's why when I would get sick, I wouldn't technically go sick. I would just try to keep pushing through it, because I wanted to keep doing what I was doing. But not listening to my doctors only led to me going to more fires, breathing in more toxins when I lost my filter when I had my sinus surgery. And unfortunately, I ended up in a building collapse. And I would say that has affected my life as much, if not more, than 9/11. At this point, I've had two fusion surgeries on my neck, but there's a lot of nerve damage, and which only adds to the neurological issues, because I have all the stuff going on in my legs, which they believe is from the toxins, but I have all the stuff going on in my arms and my hands, which they believe is from my neck. So it causes a lot of pain. That's the problem. That's the one thing I have a problem resolving, is that I guess we're our own worst enemies. That I instead of doing the smart thing, I just tried to do what I wanted to do, and I ended up, getting more, doing more damage to my body, which obviously could have been avoided. But
Is there anything else you want to add?
I personally think my story is pretty unremarkable. I like I said, I don't think I made much of a difference. I guess the quote unquote bravest thing I did that day was just get in my car and go and try. But I think historically, the world needs to know that day wasn't the end. It's become a big news story the last couple of years, but for some of us who've been dealing with these health issues essentially since day one, it's been an uphill battle. And I think those battles do kind of let those thoughts of regret slip in, when we have all these guys sick, and men and women, not just first responders, but survivors and students and all these people getting sick and dying, and nobody will listen to us. It took 18 years for Congress to finally give us some permanent legislation on the matter. Those are kind of the things that make you feel used, and make you feel like you were, expendable. They came out and told us the air was safe to breathe within days of 9/11. The EPA, Christy Whitman, Rudy Giuliani, and all these other officials. I know they had their reasons. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I'm not going to get into my thoughts on why they did it. But at the end of the day, when you do stuff like that, and then come out and acknowledge that that wasn't the truth, that the air wasn't safe, that there were 160 toxins that were created that day, 400 tons of asbestos. Common sense would tell you that that's not safe. Just the asbestos alone will kill you, let alone the 159 others. So when we have all this evidence and all these experts saying this, and then Congress still does nothing, and then they give us these 5-year bills, which are underfunded and only force more sick people to go to Washington to beg, for help, even just for the tiniest bit of help, like paying for a freaking medical, or, covering chemo, or covering, having cancer isn't cheap. Having a lot of these illnesses not only affects us, but affects our families. My family deals with 9/11 every day because of me, not just because of, like my wife lost her father that day, so she has her own issues in that. And so when the government, basically says, we can't help you, or there's nothing we could do, or we don't have the money, or how are we going to pay for it? That's where those thoughts come in. Like, well, then what, then what are we doing? How could we justify, asking men and women to step up in moments of crisis, and then when it comes time to take care of them, telling them you can't find the money? I think that's what's becoming the narrative of 9/11 is not exactly what happened that day. It's in the government's response to it, and how they treated us, and how they continue to treat the survivors of that day. It's made it harder to to find peace or find resolution, especially for, for someone like me who got involved, the last 5 or 6 years, having to go to Washington and tell this story. That's why it gets hard. It's hard for me to tell you the story because I've told it hundreds of times, not because I want to. Who wants to talk about this? They say that one of the worst things for PTSD is to have to keep reliving it, and telling the story. And I really hate them for making me and dozens of other people have to do it. Some of whom were, days, weeks away from death. And they weren't home with their families. And they had to go down there and tell the story over and over again in meetings where, half the time, the people we were talking to weren't even listening. They couldn't even give us the respect of hearing what happened on 9/11. One kid, we were telling him his story. He had to be in his 20s. This was last year. And one of the guys looked over their shoulder because they're all, they sit there and they take their notes when we're giving the information. He looked over his shoulder and he was just doodling circles. As a retired NYPD officer was talking about the 2 brain cancers that he had from 9/11. So that's hard for me to get over. Whatever happened 20 years ago, whatever Christy Whitman said, she has to live with that too. And I know she knows there are consequences to those words. She might not remember this, but she knows me from my childhood, but that's another story. So I think for me, that's the story. My 9/11 story is pretty unremarkable, but I got to witness, the best of humanity that day. Also the worst of humanity, but I choose to remember what I saw these amazing people do, like I had to be told what to do, but these guys just, by guys, I mean men and women, they just jumped in and they just went to work and they did what they had to do. Which only made it harder when we have a kid doodling in his doodle pad and he can't even listen to our story or, try to learn what happened. And then there's congressmen who, there was one guy, he had a 5-foot picture of Ground Zero on the wall of his office. It was so big that I can go up and I could pick out the people that I recognized in the picture. It was like one of those great pictures of the Bucket Brigade, and you could see, it was zoomed in. And this guy wouldn't even give us a meeting. We saw the picture because we were in his office, and I poked my head around. I'm like, he's got that hanging on the wall, and I knew he was there, and he won't even see it, sit down with us. Eventually, he gave us a meeting, and I think it took, I don't even know if he ever ended up co-sponsoring the bill. He might have voted for it, but he, and he was an ex-military member, and he obviously thought enough of 9/11 to put a 5-foot picture on his wall, but he didn't have 5 minutes to listen to the people in the picture. And that's what we were dealing with. And that's what, if anything, that's what I would make me regret, is that, you have all these people, they tweet never forget, once a year, they write these long patriotic posts, and they undoubtedly post pictures of firefighters or police officers or whatever. But when it really comes down to it, that's just eyewash. They really didn't care because we were telling them, we had Ray there dying in his wheelchair. We had Lou Alvarez dying in front of Congress and you look up and there's 3 congressmen sitting there listening to him. It shouldn't have taken Jon Stewart to get everybody's attention. So yeah, like I said, and that's what triggered, that's what bothers me the most, is that essentially you did this to us. There's nothing we could have done that day, but certainly in the days and weeks after, we could have taken a different approach to how we were going to go down there. But now you essentially sent us down there to clean up the mess, but now you're telling us you can't take care of us when we're dealing with the repercussions. So I don't know. I'm sure this.
Remember, even though you feel you didn't contribute that day, do you realize what you have contributed since? Because of people like you, the VCF was extended for 70 years. Because of people like you, there's free health care for life. Because of people like you, everyone who in the 9/11 community can get help. You, because of you, someone like you put in the hard work and you won in the end. I mean, keep that in mind. You won. We won.
Yeah,
Regardless of the people you encountered, and I'm so sorry you encountered them, but we won. And we keep this alive by doing things like this.
I I mean, it's hard to feel like it's a victory though for me, because that took. I mean, it did take a lot of hard work and a lot of my energy and a lot of my spirit. Essentially, we only have a finite amount of time on this planet. We only have a finite amount of energy, and my body is essentially at war with itself. It's constantly fighting something, and to have to use what little energy I have left to go down there, and spend days in my wheelchair and have to waste time away from my small kids. It's hard to feel like a victory. It's hard to feel like we won when Lou Alvarez had to spend his last month, in front of TV cameras instead of watching Yankee games with his kids. That's what he should have been doing. I'm happy. At the end of the day, the bill's passed and there's resolution, but it's hard to feel like a victory, especially because I see what's still going on. Having healthcare and the VCF, it does make a world of difference. But at the end of the day, we're still getting sick. People are still dying. People my age with young kids and people of all ages. There's the kids who were in school. Kids from Stuyvesant who are in their 20s or 30s and they can't get healthcare because they have these pre-existing conditions from 9/11. Like, that's insane to me. So yeah, we got the legislation, but what did we really win? I don't know. It's hard to feel like we won when I lay in bed in pain every night. When my friends keep getting diagnosed with cancer that they wouldn't have gotten. I hope to find peace with it, but right now, like I said, they made me go down there and tell that story over and over again, and just sitting in a car for 3 hours causes a tremendous amount of pain for me. I don't know. You're right. I should feel good about it, but it's hard to, because for me, the work's not done. With the Ray Pfeiffer Foundation, we see people all the time that, yeah, this stuff is nice, but at the end of the day, we still have, wives who can't get their husbands in and out of bed. We still have kids dropping out of school because their parent, we had one girl, she's 18 years old, had to drop out of college because her father was dying of cancer and had nobody to take care of him. So yeah, he can go to the doctor and when he dies, she'll be compensated. But at the end of the day, what is that doing to her life? That's going to affect her for the rest of her life. It's going to affect my kids the rest of their lives. So, it's hard to find it's hard to find the W there for me. And it shouldn't have been that hard. It shouldn't. As soon, 2003, 2004, when all this stuff started coming out, it should have just been taken care of. But that's politics in this country, I guess, right? But I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever be at peace with it, especially since I feel so terrible most of the time. you know, I don't know. I hope
Sorry.
other people, you know, at least feel it, you know, maybe either that next generation of kids, they won't have to go to Washington and have the meetings with the, you know, they'll be, you think about it, a kid who was 4 or 5 years old who got sent to one of those schools. When they're 35, how far away is 9/11 going to be in the social, I mean, the last 6 months seems like 20 years, let alone something that happened 30 years ago, and it's going to kill these kids. And who's going to listen to them then? We had a hard time getting, you know, 24-year-old interns to listen to us this time. So I guess in that, yeah, that's a win for me, is that nobody else ever has to do it again. But the rest of it, pardon my French, but fuck them. Fuck them for, you know, whatever happened 20 years ago, that happened. That was the heat of the battle. But the 10-year fight to get permanent legislation, that was done on purpose. That was, you know, that was a dagger in the back from our own government, from, you know, people like Mark Meadows asking me, well, what is New York going to do about this? Well, fuck you. That's what I wanted to say, but I had to be a professional, you know. And I said to him, well, we didn't ask Hawaii what they were going to do about Pearl Harbor getting bombed. You can't on 9/11 say we're one nation who rose from this fucking attack on us, and then in the next breath, you know, say, well, this is New York's problem. Well, am I not an American? I'm sorry, I didn't realize, you know. And that's what bothers me. And this continues. It's not just about 9/11. It's every little piece. We see it going on now. It's you know, we're all American until we're not, right? Until you know. That's another podcast.
That's another podcast. But all right, but this stands as, you know, this is history, and this, you know, you testified to your history, and that's important, and it's important for the future, and I thank you for that. And I know this was really, really difficult for you, and it's just going to make the PTSD worse every time you tell the story. So I'm sorry.
No,
I had to have you relive all of this, but it's important, and I thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine, and I do it for those reasons. That's why I did it for the last 6 years, even though it would have been easier just to roll over and go back to sleep. But I think it's important, and you know.
And I still love your tweets.
Oh, thank you. I try. It's a tough time on Twitter right now, but
yeah, keep up your spirit, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And stay safe, and
all right,
well, and love to the family.
All right, you too. Be well.